Good day, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Major Tom Howland, and with us today is Major Hal Watson, and we are going to be speaking with Colonel Simmonds, the honorary colonel of the Princess Louise Fusiliers. Colonel Simmonds joined the militia in 1933 with the 6th Canadian Machine Gun Corps, and was then joined the Princess Louise Fusiliers in 1937, with whom he served throughout World War II. And following the war, he was rejoined the regiment in 1946 upon its reorganization as part of the militia. Served with it as CO between 1948 and 52, and then served on the staff from that date till his retirement in 1961. In 1976, Colonel Simmonds was appointed Honorary Lieutenant Colonel of the Princess Louise Fusiliers, and in 1986 appointed Honorary Colonel. Now I'd like to ask Major Watson to ask some questions.
Colonel Simmonds, you joined the militia in 1933. It was long before the Second World War started. What was your motivation for joining the militia in those days?
Well, I was very interested in rifle shooting, and it was a very expensive proposition if you didn't belong to a militia unit where you got free ammunition and a rifle. And that was the reason that I joined, I think, to start with.
You were a good shot yourself?
Not at that time, but later on I think I became reasonably proficient.
In 1937, you joined the Princess Louise Fusiliers. This was a machine gun company, or a machine gun regiment. And what attracted you to that type of a role?
Well, actually, the 6th Machine Gun Battalion was amalgamated with the Princess Louise Fusiliers, and they became known as the Princess Louise Fusiliers MG. We took their name and they took our training, which I think in the long run was easier for us than it was for the original officers and men of the PLF.
So it's a Halifax regiment?
It's a Halifax regiment.
And you're a Halifax native?
I am, yes.
So that makes, does it help with the tradition that you're from the same town as your regiment?
Yes, and my father was in the Princess Louise Fusiliers also, in the First World War.
Very strong family tradition.
That's right.
When war was declared, how were you notified personally, and where were you at the time?
I was in Sydney, and I received a telegram reporting into the orderly room. And I jumped in my car and drove to Halifax and phoned the orderly room, and they said, take your time, but when you come in, be prepared to stay for a week, which is actually what happened.
Well, you must have expected war was coming if they knew you were in Sydney. This is in fact the case.
Oh, I don't think, no question about it. We all knew the war was coming.
So it didn't come as a surprise to you?
No, it did not. No.
When the regiment was mobilized, was there a mobilization plan?
Yes, it was a mobilization plan, and as I understand it, it was in the safe, which the CO pulled out and carried on from there.
Would you rate it as an effective plan?
Well, it worked. The regiment went from about 150 to 850 in about 2 weeks. We ran an assembly line for entrance. They were documented and put through medical, and then out the other door, and they were in the Army.
And how did you accommodate suddenly 800 men?
Well, we went around to the houses in the north end near the armories and asked people if they would take soldiers in, and we paid them at that time the municipal sum of 50 cents a night per person, and they would put 3 or 4 into one room, and that way they made a little bit of cash money, and 50 cents a night in those days was quite a lot of money. It doesn't seem like very much today, mind you. and it isn't.
How did you feed the troops? Where did you feed them?
That is a little bit hazy, actually, but we fed some of them in the armories, and then later on we moved to Wellington Barracks, which is now Stadacona, and we had the whole setup there.
I think one of the things that fascinated me was what exactly the unit was involved in local protection duty and where it was stationed. Could you amplify on that, please?
We had a company in Herring Cove. We had a section with a machine gun out in St. Margaret's Bay Road for a while. We had a platoon in the Halifax shipyards. We had a platoon on McNabb's Island, later on at Eastern Passage in Cow Bay. And still later on, we had a company in North Sydney, and that was split, and part of it was in Glace Bay. And we also had a company in Mulgrave.
So obviously, if the battalion was split up like this, training as a unit must have been very difficult.
Well, you couldn't train as a unit because we weren't together. The first time we trained as a unit was in 1941 when we all got together in Aldershot.
And what was the role of the unit at this stage? Just regular infantry?
Yes, we were straight infantry at that time.
One of the things that interested me again was I understand you had, for a brief period, command of a landing craft here in Halifax Harbor. Would you tell us about that?
Well, they wanted somebody to run a couple of small landing craft who knew a little bit about the shores around Halifax, and it sounded like a good job, so I took it, and we had a company or a battery sent down every day from Debert, and we had a tank on one landing craft and a truck on the other one, and we'd load up the company or battery and take them out, run up on the shore of McNabb's Island, drop the gate, and the troops would storm the island. And after that was over, we would load them back on, bring them back to Shearwater, and they would go back to Debert.
So that made for a long day, didn't it?
No, not really. They arrived at 10 o'clock in the morning from Debert, and they left at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, so that they would be back in time for supper at 5. Well, the outfit that looked after the landing craft before I took over were doing the same thing. This particular day they went out, they landed and put the gate down, and instead of keeping the engines turning over forward so that the landing craft would not back off when the tank hit the beach, they cut the motors. The tank pushed the landing craft back, and the tank disappeared. I think it's the only hole on the shores of McNabb's Island. At low tide, we could see the top of the aerial on the tank. A few days later, Brigadier Burns and Major General Worthington came down, and they said they'd like to go see the tank. So I took them out, and we hovered over the hole where the tank was, and Worthington made a casual remark, well, that's $100,000, but we'll send you another one down right away. And then they said they'd like to go on the landing craft for a spin. All right, so we went through Eastern Passage and around McNabb's Island and came in the harbor entrance. And of course, you realize there was a net up and 2 gate boats. Nobody had ever heard of us. They didn't know who we were, and they wouldn't let us in. It took about 4 hours before word came back that we would be allowed in. And by this time, the 2 generals were not too happy. There was nothing to eat and or drink on board. And by the time we got in, it was pitch dark, and I think they left for the mess immediately.
Did they ever salvage that tank?
Yes, they did. they got the Hal crane over, and they hooked onto it, and the cables broke. The Navy divers put the cables on. In the meantime, the Navy divers had returned to shore, so two of my chaps stripped down and took the cables down and went through the top of the turret and out the driver's slit with the cables and brought the ends up, and this took quite a long while and quite a few dives. But the Hal crane was then able to lift the tank out, put it on the deck of the Hal crane where there were mechanics waiting. They immediately attacked the tank. By the time the Hal crane was towed over to Halifax, they were able to lift the motor out and put it in a tank of anti-corrosive liquid supplied by the Air Force from Shearwater, and I understand they saved most of the motor.
Could you please tell us about your first contact with General Burns on the rifle range at the Bird?
Well, General Burns came out the rifle range, and I had a crowd of men out there trying to get them finished up and qualifying the rifle. And he asked to see the company commander, and I said I was the company commander, and he said, well, you're only a lieutenant. I said, that's correct, sir. And it's always been my understanding the brigade was holding up the promotion. Well, I asked him if he'd like to have a shoot, and he said he would. And I made sure he had a good score. And 5 days later, my captain, she came through, dated back 9 months.
I must have meant I had a lot of extra money for you.
That was a lot of money in those days.
Right. And then it was off to England, and I'll ask Major Watson to take over.
Sir, how did you get across to England, and when did you leave?
I'm tempted to say we swam, but we didn't. We went on the Queen Elizabeth, along with about 15,000 other people. And we were fed twice a day, and funnily enough, we had Vickers machine guns up on the top deck, and they were manned the whole way across. And we were just getting near, I think, about 600 miles west of England when a Sunderland flying boat came out and signaled there were a pack of submarines waiting for us. We turned, and instead of going due east, we turned and went northwest. And then instead of landing at Southampton, we came into Greenock. But we didn't see any of the submarines, and they couldn't catch her because she was too fast.
What were conditions like aboard the Queen Elizabeth? I take it wasn't decked out as a luxury liner then?
No, there were 6 captains in the cabin I was in with, I think it was built for 2. And the men on E-deck were in bunks 7 tiers high. You couldn't sit up in them. You could lay down very comfortably, but you couldn't sit up. But they, nobody seemed to mind. They really enjoyed themselves. The food was excellent, although we only got fed twice a day. But you could have all you wanted, and nobody starved.
How did the English treat you when you arrived? Was it a cordial reception? Were they happy to see you?
I think they were among some of the most magnificent people I've ever met. With what they put up with from the Germans and from their allies, I think they were absolutely fantastic.
What did you do in England by way of training and an operational role? Did you have a role when you arrived there, or was it all training?
No, every unit actually went to Aldershot for 3 or 4 months. And we trained, and then we ended up on the down, on Box Hill. And we were converted for a short time to a chemical warfare battalion, which meant flamethrowers mounted on carriers. And we split the battalion up. And A Company trained wheel drivers. B Company, which was my company, we trained track drivers. C Company trained them on the use of the flamethrower, and D Company trained them the tactical use of the flamethrower. That was mostly by guess and by God, because there weren't any pamphlets or anything else to tell you what to do. But later on, it became the training we had there was absolutely fantastic for this reason, that we had all kinds of wheel drivers and all kinds of carrier drivers. And in my company, which was supposed to be 142 strong, we went in sometimes with 80. And people were driving carriers that weren't supposed to be, and but they could all drive. So we were never at a loss to move, which turned out to be a great thing.
You proceeded to the division out of England, and you went on a personal adventure. Could you describe where you went when you left England?
Well, they were going to send out about 200 officers to get battle experience in North Africa. By the time we got there, we owned North Africa, so we never did get into action there. But we saw quite a bit of North Africa, and we drove across a good part of it, and ended up in Bizerta, and from there we went to Italy.
And then you arrived in Italy, and I think I'll leave that to Major Howland.
Well, how did you get to Italy from North Africa?
On an LST.
Landing ship tank.
Right.
And what type of ship was this? Was it big, small?
Well, coming across North Africa to Italy, we were on an LST, which is a pretty good-sized vessel. There were about 240 of us, plus the crew. And I think 235 were seasick. Well, the other chaps that weren't seasick, beside myself, suggested we have a little game of craps. I was willing, and for once in my life, I made 14 straight passes with the dice, cleaned them all out, made $625 in 25 minutes. I sent $200 to my wife and bought $200 war bonds, and about 3 weeks later I got 5 days off and went to Naples with the rest.
And where did you land when you got to Italy?
In Naples.
Naples. And from Naples, you then proceeded to join your regiment?
No, we went to Avellino to the reinforcement depot, and from there up to the unit. While I was at the Forward Reinforcement Battalion waiting to go back to my own unit, Marlene Dietrich and her husband came up, and they made a stage from some trucks and forms folding and tables 6-foot folding, and there were about 5,000 troops sitting around in a little natural amphitheater. And she came out on the stage in a beautiful evening dress, and she had a lovely figure. And there was a long drawn-out whistle. And she just held her hand up. And she said, "Fellows, I'm sorry, it's all mine, and I'm going to keep it." From there on, she was a huge success. Also, she was awfully nice. She did not go forward with the officers as much as she put her foot forward to be nice to the nursing sisters. There were, I think, probably a dozen nursing sisters, and she talked to every one of them. She also collected shoulder flashes, which I understand later her husband took from her. But she was very, very nice, and very, very nice to the nursing sisters, which I thought was a very good thing on her part.
What were your first impressions of Italy? The ground, the climate, the people?
Well, the climate in southern Italy is beautiful. winter, you can get winter in the mountains that run right down the spine of Italy. But by and large, it's a lovely climate. With regard to the people, we didn't get to know too many of them, but they were nice enough. They tried to be helpful when they could. I think that's about it on that.
When did you actually join the regiment then, to rejoin the Princess Louise Fusiliers?
Just up at, before we took Casino, joined them up there.
So that was your first time in combat, at around the time of Casino?
Yes.
How did you feel about going into combat the first time?
No problem. The first time, there's nothing to it. You think that it's an exercise, and you're gonna go in there, and you haven't run into anything like it. You don't know what it's gonna be. After that, it's a different thing when you found out what it is. I think everybody would agree that the more you go in and come out, the harder it is to go back. But you do it, you have a job, and you do your job.
What was the role of the Princess Louise Fusiliers in Italy?
We were what we call a support battalion. We had a 11 brigade group, and we had a 12 brigade group, and each group consisted of a machine gun, Vickers machine gun company, and a 4.2 mortar company. And we were in support of each of our brigades. We were doing support for them, mostly neutralizing areas that were bothering the troops advancing and firing over their heads or in front of them, and in this way cutting down their opposition.
The 11th and 12th Brigade were both part of the 5th Canadian Division.
Yeah.
What other Canadian formations were in the Canadian Corps at that time in Italy?
Oh, there was the 1st Division, which was made up of 3 brigades, and the 5th Division, which was made up of a tank regiment, and they found in that country that 1 infantry brigade wasn't enough, and that's why they created the 12th Infantry Brigade.
On a more detailed note, you mentioned basically how the machine guns were employed. Specifically, how did you deploy your machine guns, and how did you set up or survey the ground to set your machine guns up?
You picked your spot from a map, and you went there, and you might not exactly be on that exact spot. You moved a little bit around where you could do your job the best, and usually you fired from behind a crest. One of the main things you had to worry about was crest clearance, but that wasn't too difficult to figure out. And the machine guns, usually you fired them from 2,500 to 4,500 yards, and so we didn't see what we were shooting at. We put them in by the map and compass, and you could do it very, very accurately.
How many machine guns did you have in your company?
12 machine guns. That's 4 to a platoon. They were put in never less than 2 firing together, but usually a platoon, the guns were placed 15 yards apart. That's 45 yards, and you would cover probably 55, 65 yards. With your beaten zone at 2,900 yards is roughly 180 yards by 60 yards. So you're covering a fair amount of territory with a lot of ammunition.
Do you recall what the approximate average rate of fire would be?
Well, the guns fire at a rate of 600 rounds per minute.
So that was, it'd be very uncomfortable to be on the receiving end of that.
Yes, it would. You wouldn't probably fire 600 rounds a minute. There was about 250 rounds in a belt. You probably get 2 belts off in a minute, which would be about 500, but the gun actually fired at the rate of 600 rounds per minute. Well, most of the platoon commanders were very, very able fellows, and they looked after themselves, they looked after their troops. I went out one afternoon to visit one of my platoons, and I found the platoon commander in bed, dressed with his boots on between silk sheets. He had his carrier outside the window with his mic inside the window, his map covered with talc on the bed beside him. While we were talking, a request came in for fire. He stopped, worked out the angle of sight and the elevation, picked up the mic, called the sergeant at the gun position about 150 yards away, and said 4 belts rapid, 4 degrees right, 6 degrees elevation. Carry on, Sergeant. Put it down, said, now is there anything else you want to know, sir?
How long would it take for you to deploy your company and set up and start firing?
Well, it depends. Do you mean from the start line or?
From pulling into a position where you're going to set
Well,
up?
the platoons usually went to different spots where they could do their job. And the platoon would go into action, in about 5 minutes probably, pinpoint their spot on the map, find out where they want their 0 line, get the compass bearing, put their guns in on that, parallel their guns, and they're away.
Was this considerably different from what they trained you in peacetime with the Vickers machine gun?
Yeah, well, in peacetime they tell you to go and top the hill with a direction finder and aim back onto the guns, and then you switch from one gun to the other, reading the back bearing, and then you have your guns all parallel. But it's not considered advisable in wartime to stand on top of a hill.
So how long would that system have taken if you'd used it?
No, it wouldn't take very long. You could do it. Probably 5 minutes, but
It's just the danger involved.
the danger involved, then you're going to climb up about 100 yards or so away from the guns and aim back at them.
Before I get into the logistical questions, I have one more operational question I'd like to ask you, sir. What's the difference between direct fire and indirect fire with a heavy machine gun?
Well, direct fire, you're firing at something you can see. On the rear of the Vickers is a leaf sight. It stands up, and you put your elevation on that. On indirect fire, you cannot see what you're shooting at, and you use a dial sight. That gives you degrees and so on. And it's the way we actually like to use the machine guns, because, quite frankly, if you can't see them, they can't see you.
I imagine the Germans were quick to reply.
Their counter-battery and counter-mortar fire was absolutely fantastic. The mortars would come back within 2 minutes. And shells, very shortly after.
So I imagine you were well dug in.
We were. We dug. There were slip trenches. Actually, in the majority of cases, after machine guns had completed their task, whether it was 4 bells for rapid or what, the men left the guns and headed for shelter somewhere 100 yards or so away, because that was when Jerry would come back with counter battery fire and mortars.
Right.
So it wasn't a good idea to hang around.
12 machine guns must have used up a tremendous amount of ammunition. How did you resupply? You must have resupplied during the fight.
Well, we did in my company, it's the company sergeant major's tasked to bring ammunition up, which he did. And that particular night, I think we fired something like 108,000 rounds out of 12 machine guns. We wore out 2.5 barrels per gun. That's the average. Some wore 3, some wore 2. But they kept the ammunition coming, and they kept the barrels coming, and we kept the guns going.
And I have to ask this question for professional pride and other reasons. Who brought the ammunition to you?
Well, the Army Service Corps brought the ammunition up to our rear, and we took it from there. And they do. The Army Service Corps did and always has done, as far as I'm concerned, a terrific job.
I hated to ask with the commercial, but I had to. Thank you very much. Did you suffer casualties yourself in your own unit?
Oh yes, we always had it. We didn't have too many, but we always had a few.
Anybody that you knew or that you affected you personally?
Well, I knew them all, but it's one of those things that you get used to it. One great thing about it, everything is going to be you. It's going to be somebody else. So as long as you are there and you're going to have casualties, there's a war on.
What are your impressions of the battle itself? When you're into it, is it stop and go? Is it continuous? Are there punctuation points in the battle, or is it just something that flows through on you?
Well,
it's a very personal impression. I know I'm asking.
In our case, it was a question of keeping the machine guns and the mortars going, and this we did. We did not know how the infantry were getting on until a bit later on, and then we heard they were on the ridge, and that was all we wanted to know.
You ceased fire?
We ceased fire, oh yes.
And that's when you know you've won?
Pardon?
That's when you realize to accomplish your mission, you've actually won the...
Right.
So there's a feeling that it's over.
Yes, it was. It was over, thank heavens. Yes, I remember once seeing a line of prisoners, approximately 100, the private in front and the corporal behind. And I said to the corporal, "Is that all the guards you have?" And this German sergeant major in Oxonian English said, "We're not going anywhere. We're very glad to be out of it." And they just kept on going.
After the battle itself and the German positions have been cleared, what did the division do? Where did you go then?
We went back to Coriano, and we took up residence in Coriano, and had a bit of a do, and relaxed mostly, and sat around for a day or so, and then after that get all our equipment back in order, our ammunition brought up to strength again, carriers maintained, the guns all gone over, and then after that you can take it easy. We had 4 or 5 days leave coming to us, and this officer asked me, "I'd like to go over to Tunis." Now please remember, we were in Italy. And I said, "Yeah, but how are we going to get there?" Well, we got down to the American Air Force. They had a hospital over in Tunis. So we went down and we asked at the counter, and the chap said, "Well, I have nothing to say about it. It's up to the pilot whether he'll take you or not. Go down and see so-and-so." So we went down, and the fellow said, "Sure, I'll take you over." He said, "Get on the 2 stretchers there," which we did. We were put in, hung up in the rack, and the plane took off, and we started to get out of the stretchers, and the nurse wouldn't let us out. We were wounded. We finally convinced her that we weren't wounded, and we got out. We went forward and talked to the captain of the aircraft, and got into Tunis airfield. Went in. We had 3 or 4 good days, and then we tried to get back, and we couldn't get out. We couldn't get a flight. Well, finally we did get back, and we hitched our way. We got up back to the unit, and the company was all drawn up in line, ready to go to the front. All I do is get off this truck and get in the front seat of my Jeep, and away we went. And the CO said, I was just going to report you as a deserter. Now the difference being AWL, if I'd have come back and we weren't going to the front, it would have been AWL. But if you miss an action, then you are classified as a deserter.
In our readings, we've learned that General Leese, in fact, the 8th Army Commander, was very, very complimentary towards the Canadians in their role in the back-breaking the Gothic line. Was that passed down to you in the field? Did you
Yes,
know
it
that?
was. We were all thanked, and the whole 11th Brigade got battle honors for taking Coriander Ridge. It's something I don't think any of them will ever forget either.
Tom, I'll leave the after the battle to you.
Well, after the battle, which was September 1944, you stayed in Italy, northern Italy, until February 1945?
February 25th, I think it was, we sailed on an American LST to Marseille, and went to an American transit camp just outside of Marseille and wait for the rest of the division to come over. And we got over to the transit camp outside of Marseille. Everybody wanted to go into Marseille, but it was out of bounds. Well, the chap I met on the LST going over to Marseille was a photographer reporter. And he asked me if I'd like to go into Marseille, and I said, sure, how are we going to do it? He said, put on a private's jacket and drive the Jeep for me. And this is what I did, and this is how I saw Marseille. Now, I didn't get out of the Jeep or go into any store or bistro, but I did see Marseille.
And where did you proceed from there?
From there, we drove right up through the whole of France into Belgium.
And rejoined the first Canadian Army.
This then became part of the 1st Canadian Army, yes.
So that was the first time in the war that the Canadian Army had all been operating together under Canadian command.
Right.
And the war must have been almost over.
It was just about over, yeah.
So when did you effectively join up with the 1st Canadian Army?
It would have been, let's see, only sometime latter part of March, because they gave us all a week's leave when we got into Belgium, because we hadn't been in England for a year and a half or something.
Was there any resentment in the Corps coming from Italy versus, about the lack of coverage they'd received in Italy versus what the troops in Northwest Europe have been up to, and getting vast amounts of publicity over their actions and battles?
No, I don't think any of that, but we got called D-Day Dodgers, and we asked, our stock answer was, what D-Day? Because we'd been fighting for some time before they'd gone into action. But it was always good for a bit of a brawl.
45 years after the war, you've obviously maintained an interest and association with the Princess Louise Fusiliers. You were involved with the regiment after the war until your retirement in 1961, and now in your present capacity as honorary colonel. Did your wartime experiences influence your outlook on the role of the Canadian forces in Canada today? Is this why you stayed on afterwards?
Well, I enjoy it, and camaraderie is something that you don't get anywhere else. And particularly just after the war, most of the chaps in the unit, right from top down, were all veterans, and we'd all been together and trusted each other, and it was something that I liked. So I stayed with it.
Very good. Thank you very much, Colonel Simmonds, for being with us today, and Major Watson. We've been speaking to Colonel Simmonds, the honorary colonel of the Princess Louise Fusiliers.
Thank you. Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Military parades are traditional in Halifax, a legacy of the city's British connection. Today was no exception as one of Canada's oldest militia regiments exercised a right granted by the city generations ago. As John Waterman reports, this year's event was extra special.
One of the oldest militia regiments in Canada, the Princess Louise Fusiliers traces its roots to the founding of Halifax in 1749. In 1869, the regiment was a guard of honor for a visit to Halifax by Canada's first Governor-General, the Marquis of Lorne, and his consort, Princess Louise. In 1952, the regiment received new colors and granted freedom of the city of Halifax.
Freedom of the city dates back to, I believe, the 16th, 17th century, when foreign bodies of troops who had been well behaved were granted the right to march through a particular city with drums beating, bayonets fixed, and colors flying. It represented a trust between the civilian population and the soldiers who were garrisoned there.
Today, the Princess Louise Fusiliers, now the city's official regiment, exercised its right. This year, the regiment is celebrating its 123rd anniversary, an event marked by inspection of the ranks and a thank you from the Deputy Mayor of Halifax.
You are to be congratulated for your accomplishments over the years. I note that battle honors included activities in Northwest Canada, South Africa, as well as the First and Second World Wars.
Its right exercised, the Princess Louise Fusiliers marched back to headquarters. Another ceremony completed, celebrating a relationship between regiment and city spanning 3 centuries. In Halifax, John Waterman, ATV News.
That's news for now, but when we return, the Blue Jays take it on the chin again.